Hey, it's Brett, and I am reading Emancipatory Mutual Aid from Education to Liberation, and this was put together by PREP Neighborhoods. Not sure if I pronounced that right. The COVID 19 pandemic has strained and even overwhelmed the public health, Medicare, and disaster response systems, where governments and state agencies were ill prepared to contain and suppress infectious outbreaks. In countries where emergency lockdown procedures have been adopted without accompanying policies to guarantee income security and housing tenure, there is the additional problem of economic hardship. Already existing and newly formed non governmental organizations and associations have mobilized to fill the gap. These formal and informal groups assist people forced into the margins by government neglect with free meals, grocery and medicine deliveries, safe housing, and even cash. They are going beyond traditional voluntary charity disaster relief to provide personal protective equipment, notably face masks, COVID 19 symptoms monitoring, accurate information about locally available COVID 19 and antibody testing facilities, emotional counseling, and more. In some cases, these organizations partner with public agencies, including in situations where state institutions are both omnipresent and capable, and voluntary associations are essentially licensed subcontractors of the state, as appears to be the case, but only in part, in the People's Republic of China. In other contexts, particularly where robust social safety nets are lacking, or where austerity has undermined any expectation of government assistance, people have done what they have always done in a crisis: attempted to stem the tide of misery with the resources they have. Some of these organizations or associations of individuals are describing their efforts to help those in trouble as mutual aid organizations. These groups reflect social or political philosophies of their founders and members from a devotion to principles of community self help, in both its conservative and radical variants, to a belief that systematically oppressed groups best overcome their oppression through collective self management and self provisioning. They distinguish themselves from charity organizations by their lack of formal association with either the government or the nonprofit or religious charity sector, and identify as just people helping other people in need. In New Orleans, for example, a mutual aid group mobilized by Jasmine Arahu called Southern Solidarity has emerged guided by black feminist liberatory thought and inspired by the direct relief and organizing practices of the Black Panthers. The group of 30 organized daily delivery of food, medical resources, and other basic needs directly to 300 unhoused people in the downtown area of New Orleans because the government failed to meet these needs. Southern Solidarity is involved in both direct relief and consciousness raising efforts of members and recipients. Members act on the principle that when those who are oppressed receive needs, they are better equipped to move from survival mode to organizing. Key members include trans activists, organizers, formerly incarcerated, and the unhoused. What is mutual aid? Mutual aid, as a political concept, is drawn from the work of anarchist and scientist Peter Kropotkin. In 1902, Kropotkin published Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, which argued that it was human cooperation and not competition which has facilitated the survival of our species. Additionally, Kropotkin proposed that the best system of economic and social organization would be one based on mutual exchanges rather than coercion and the profit motive. Mutual aid societies or benevolent societies have long arisen among the disenfranchised groups to fill in gaps in insurance, support, education, and relief. Examples include the Free African Society, formed in the late 18th century, Philadelphia, by formerly enslaved men and contemporary organizations of refugees and immigrants such as the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association in Lowell, Massachusetts, where members gather and share resources to face shared challenges. The labor movement was founded on the principle of collective organization for mutual benefit of its members and helped politicize such assistance as acts of solidarity, not charity. The radical edges of the labor movement, as represented by the industrial workers of the world, broke through the in-group orientation of mutual aid efforts with their slogan, an injury to one is an injury to all. While the Black Panthers' free breakfast programs was acknowledged charity operation in response to the poverty imposed on black people in the United States, the Panthers viewed it as facilitating the development of revolutionary people. In short, people who are in need of basic necessities such as food cannot effectively rebel until they have those needs met. In light of budget austerity and the shredding of social services, mutual aid has become a term loosely applied to all kinds of charity supplied by voluntary organizations. For those interested in liberatory mutual aid, it is crucial to carefully consider what should be the standards for such efforts. An emancipatory mutual aid is not only about connecting those in need to services or even directly providing services, but also about organizing with those in need to assert their human rights and demand what is socially just from systems of exploitation and domination. In the spirit of the Zapatista principle of mandar obedeciendo, ob- obedeciendo, leadership from below, efforts must be made to assure that the agency and voice of those receiving aid are equal to or even ahead of those providing it, despite the apparent disparity in resources. An impressive example of large-scale mutual aid endeavor during the 20 during the COVID-19 crisis comes from a favela of 100,000 people in Sao Paulo, Brazil. There, 400 presidents took responsibility for the welfare of 50 families apiece, tracking COVID-19 symptoms in family members and preparing and distributing thousands of hot meals every day. Radical mutual aid aims to open up space for those forced into dispossession to interrogate why it is that those providing resources are in possession of such resources and those receiving them are not, and also to question why those providing resources are providing them. That is, one component of mutual aid at its best is education and consciousness raising about power relations, but not only the power relations between mutual aid donors, distributors, and beneficiaries, but also the power dynamics that structure political and economic conditions and social interactions in the places where the mutual aid organizations are active. Consciousness raising might also include education internal to mutual aid teams. For example, training on anti racism, disability justice, harm reduction, and gender studies. While Southern Solidarity members in New Orleans are immersed in necessary and labor intensive direct relief efforts that push back against decades of racist austerity measures, group members are encouraged to participate in reading groups and training as well as protests demanding that the government provide adequate resources for all. Southern Solidarity invites the on house to reading groups and protests as a way to organize recipients around liberation efforts. An emancipatory mutual aid consciously strives to both prevent the further disempowerment of the recipients and, when possible, push in the other direction, providing platforms on which people can work toward determining their community's own fate. Southern Solidarity members act under the premise that solidarity necessitates a deep understanding of the systemic forces of oppression that have created dispossession and crisis. Acts of charity alone do not require a deep understanding of systemic oppression, thereby limiting their role as an integral force toward movement building. On the other hand, action oriented mutual aid interventions motivated by the urge to do something, but inattentive to contesting those hierarchies and dependencies, run the risk of reestablishing exploitative relationships in the very act of trying to help them out. Practicing liberation. A mutual aid practice that aims to augment rather than reduce the autonomy and self determination of those in need must avoid the missionary model, however secular. Rather than parachuting in from the outside to save those in distress, practitioners of a liberatory mutual aid will acknowledge and work with existing community emergency response and disaster resilience networks that are not tied into the power structure that brought about the problem in the first place. To avoid duplicating efforts already undertaken by existing organizations and to make well informed choices about what is needed where, from the very beginning, mutual aid startups need to break bread with other organizations in their locality. Southern Solidarity, for instance, has collaborated with a variety of organizations, including People's Assembly, Overcoming Racism, New Orleans Workers Hospitality Alliance, Tristerio, Beloved, Women, Women with a Vision, Greater New Orleans Caring Collective, and Hidden History Tours. In addition to connecting with local organizations, mutual aid groups with claims to radical liberatory frameworks should refer back to the work of past and current liberation fighters specific to their locale and acknowledge how people shape the current political terrain. Despite heightened levels of inequity and racism, New Orleans, again our example, has long been a site of cultural resistance to white supremacy. What Ishmael Reed fictionalized as Jegru in the novel Mumbo Jumbo, from the 1911 or from the 1811 slave revolt to the recent Take 'em Down movement, organizing in New Orleans is characterized by both delegitimization of the narrative of power of the colonial head and an emphasis on the dignity of black life in all its manifestations. Southern Solidarity emerged out of this milieu and upholds that history by working with local healers, musicians, advocates, activists, and scholars such as Spirit McIntyre and Angela Kinlaw, who continue to pass down affirmation of black life in a variety of ways. Scholars with an activist impulse might be best off collaborating with community based organizations with which they already have long standing relations based on or rooted in mutual trust. One possible vocation of a people's expert is to comprehensively map community capabilities. Research that enables community members themselves to better understand the array of emergency response and disaster resilience resources they already have at their disposal, as well as resources they lack. These capabilities are often grounded in distinctive histories unique to a place. For example, in the aftermath of 2018's devastating Camp Fire disaster recovery, activists in Northern California got a crash course education in disaster management policy. Leveraging a core idea in the National Emergency Response and Disaster Recovery Framework, the primacy of local communities in deciding the substance of disaster recovery plans, the activists coalesced around tribal governments. The governments contended that their status as sovereign tribes qualified them as public agencies eligible to secure contracts and jobs in disaster recovery. Coalition members gained practical experience as executors of disaster recovery. The learning and skills that this thus required, the learning and skills thus acquired became part of the community's repertoire of disaster resilience capabilities, ready to be activated when the COVID 19 crisis and state lockdown directives came to Northern California. Exercises in sizing up a community's capabilities can help community members and scholars alike realize the distinctiveness of a locality's history and conditions and guard against the tendency to propose one size fits all solutions in mutual aid practice. At the same time, a community might be endowed with remarkable survival skills, its story very much worth telling, not least because there might be some generalizable lessons about disaster resilience to be drawn from it. Taking an inventory of community capabilities also entails identifying social groups isolated from mainstream communication flows, such as sectarian religious groups, especially important knowledge to have on hand during contagious disease outbreaks. A bedrock principle of an emancipatory mutual aid is providing space for communities to collectively deliberate and decide upon their own needs and priorities. Assemblies and other democratic fora are settings in which such deliberation and decision making might occur. Consistent with this, action researchers and people's experts with an interest in emancipatory mutual aid might conceive their roles to be facilitators and catalyzers of community self determination. Mutual aid during COVID 19. The exceptional circumstances of the COVID 19 pandemic pose peculiar challenges to mutual aid organizations imbued with a self management ethic. Under ordinary circumstances, it is a rule of thumb that those who do the work have a prominent voice in deciding what work will consist of, from the assessment of needs to the disbursement of funds. But when some organization members are at high risk of contracting severe COVID 19 and cannot do these aspects of the work that involve leaving home, there needs to be a recalibration of collective responsibilities and collective governance such that homebound members continue to have a say in what the organization as a whole does. Mutual aid can thus be characterized as that which is necessary to help fundamentally transform the conditions that created the crisis in the first place. The emergency was here long before the virus arrived. Mutual aid ranges from basic necessities to emotional support with the expectation that help is a shared community, giving across giving and receiving. All must have an equal voice regardless of position or resources. Democratic organizations that are horizontal and offer opportunities for autonomous organizing by those in relation to each other offer the greatest shot at realizing the dream of the Black Panthers and the Landless Movement and many others across the world that fed, educated, and healthy people could dismantle the capitalism and racism that, among other dangers, exposes millions to the worst of outbreaks. We can bring about new worlds based on assimilating our shared fates. Pandemic Research for the People, PREP Neighborhoods, is John Gulick, Jasmine Araujo, Cora Roloffs, Tanya Kersen, Meliza Figuera, Etant Dupain, Serena Stein, Deborah Wallace, Ryan Petaway, John Cho, Luca de Crescenzo, Audrey Snyder, Colin Claker, and Rob Wallace. And just as an aside from somebody who went through COVID 19 or went through the pandemic in 2020, um, the mutual aid networks that popped up then really did present a big opportunity for community transformation and integration. Um, it it caused a lot of conflict too because people tend to feel a sense of ownership with resources that they distribute, And that's why people say, oh, well, if you give it to this guy, he's just gonna go drink it, or, you know, that guy doesn't actually need it. He has a decent vehicle. Well, sometimes you go into homelessness with a decent vehicle. It's not going to be the first thing that you sell because that's your best asset. That's how you can store your stuff safely without needing to go through the shelter system, which is a whole nother uh, a whole nother issue for homelessness, um, which I've pretty much always been somewhere on the homelessness spectrum. Um, I live in a small camper that I own now, um, and I'm on property where, um, I'm able to take care of all my needs with what I have. Um, but at the time, I was living in a trailer park and working full time as an essential worker, delivering pizzas on a college campus. It was a ghost town. It cost me more in food and cigarettes to show up and be at work than I even made in tips. Um, and of course, my job didn't give any kind of hazard pay. So, if you ever wonder why I'm feral against the capitalist system that fucked everybody over in 2020, that was my experience. But uh, community wise, like this was published May 21st, 2020. Um, if I remember correctly, that might have been the day George Floyd was killed, murdered by Derek Chauvin in the police department. Um, so there was a much further expansion on the context for what mutual aid is after that happened, and we started to organize on the ground. And I learned a lot. I'm still learning a lot. Um, like mutual aid, it's not readily apparent that not only does it need to help people with their problems today, but it needs to do more than just giving somebody the money that they need to give to a landlord. Because we also need to break the system of housing that makes being a landlord so lucrative and so many people homeless and without resources. So, expanding upon what mutual aid is really important because we all know at a surface level 5 years later what it is, because it became something more than what was discussed um, in the world that this was written in. Um, since then, I don't know that I've really seen mutual aid networks stick and hold. There was a lot of engagement for a long time, but the person who was doing it in Madison, where I lived at the time, he was also trying to spin that into a political career or, some kind of activist. Um, uh, .tm. Uh, and this is why I read more than talk extemporaneously. Um, if you haven't seen my other videos, I don't talk off, I don't talk as fast as I read, um, or nearly as clearly. But I do think that mutual aid, and especially making the emphasis on emancipatory and liberatory mutual aid, um, is important, more important than um, labor organizing. In my experience over the past 6 months, since I really started trying to organize my former employer now. Um, got fired for the solicitation and insubordination. So, if you're gonna go out unionizing, that's that's a good one to go out with on paper. Hopefully, I get a good attorney. But anyway, what Juneau, Wisconsin needs more than um, unions in Dodge County and Wisconsin and the Midwest and the world need more mutual aid. We can't organize the way that we did 100 years ago when the Wobblies were out there fighting. And, um, you know, the desperation of the 30s after the stock market crash in 29, um, things got a lot worse then, and they're on track to get a lot worse now. Charlie Kirk just got shot in the neck today, like assassinated on TV. We have a different reality. We need to build something better because the beast that's rumbling across the across the world of capitalism and fascism and hatred, um, there's no stopping it. It's only uh, dismantling it, overturning it. Um, so, on the topic of revolutions, it's not, revolutions don't happen on a switch, it's a process. And maybe in the future, the history books will say that right now, we're in the second year of, a revolution we didn't know we were in. But, there's been so many key factors happening over the past 5 and 10 years that uh, the ramshackle state of capitalism in our economy, globally and domestically, is such that our best shot at survival is to help each other and learn how to get over our bullshit. Um, One of the things I learned more about anarchism when I was homeless and living in my truck than I could ever learn in a library. Because at the end of the day, we make sure everybody gets something to eat because that's the way that it should be. And people will put a significantly larger share of their resources out there to make sure that everybody has something, then you see people that are worried about 10% of their, uh, not even 10% of their check is going to mutual aid efforts, probably. But the agency and sense of ownership that people have, that those resources are theirs individually after, it needs to be overcome. Just like I was worried before about setting a bunch of food out in the break room for everybody to eat. And then I was like, oh, well, you know what? Actually, even if some asshole takes it, assholes that take shit need to eat too. Like, there's probably more going on than whether or not Nancy takes all the cupcakes. So, if you can find a way to prioritize and orient yourself toward a liberatory mindset where, you know, it's a better use of my resources to worry about how I can stretch what little I have to be as effective as possible because that's what's rewarding to me. I like building community. I like being the person that people call when they need to get driven somewhere. I love road trips. I just Went to Illinois yesterday, but I will read more about some mutual aid soon. Right now, I'm still on a big kick about how we need to prevent bad jacketing and fed jacketing and all these things at protests because unfortunately, Indivisible and 50501 movement are very outspoken against disruptive actions at protests, and they're sucking up a lot of the coverage and legitimacy for what needs to be a much less candorous revolution. Um, Indonesia, Nepal, Palestine, and LA, and Washington, D.C., and Chicago. Um, we're all in this together, um, and that should be our primary focus. I've given a lot of my resources that could have gone to other people, but in the moment went to people that listen to Alex Jones every day and believe in hollow moon theory. Um, and it wasn't fully altruistic either. When you live in Wisconsin and it's fall in a truck, you could die freezing at night. But if you've got a few bodies inside of an SUV, that keeps it more tolerable and you can share body heat. But, that when it comes down to that, when it's actual survival, you can kind of see more of what we have in common with each other. And the fact is that I would rather be wrong about somebody deserving their basics and dignity than be right about it not being important, because I don't see a way for it to be right that people should be all on their own with things. We could handle a lot of society's problems if people had ready and available access to resources, once we could remove that sense of shame from, if there wasn't property, then we might have communal orchards with more apples than we could ever pick. And, you know, that would be better. So if you please subscribe. I do reading of a lot of different stuff, and I continue to expand on the topics. I'm on a political kick until things get less crazy. Until then, I'm trying to read at least once a day. Get more stuff available for people to read or listen to without having to go to some AI shit. Um, so thank you. If you want to support, I do have support information in my bio, but you don't have to. The goal is just to make things available to people. A lot of times I record my first read through, and that way, you know, it's worth a little bit extra if it helps other people. Thank you.